So without further ado, we're going to be talking about learning novelty efficiently, if my mouse will work here. What happened to my mouse? Okay. And obviously, I'm Rachel St. Clair. I did my PhD at the Florida Atlantic University here in Florida, and now I'm doing a postdoc research fellow position for the next 6 months to maybe a year. I'm also the CEO of Simuli Inc., which is a new startup to make resource-efficient chips for scalable and more intelligent AI. So the main topic that I want to draw everyone's attention to is that efficiently learning new things and retaining that knowledge after learning is something that is missing from the current AI landscape. And I think that it's really important for general learning and AGI. So as we're going through this, try to remember that what we really care about here is efficiently learning new things. And when we learn those new things, that we don't forget that we learned them just because we learned something else. So if we look at the way the brain does this, and since you told me some of you guys aren't neuroscience people, so the brain learns within resource constraints. So what does that mean? That just means that neurons are finite, right? We have about 86 billion neurons as an adult. We have more when we're babies, and we actually lose a bunch. And then we kind of stabilize into this 86 billion configuration, and we don't really grow new neurons. Okay, but we do change the synaptic connections between neurons and the size of those connections, right? Synaptic pruning and growth. And that process in part supports learning. So another thing that the brain does, which is part of this learning within resource constraints, is the ability to recover after damage. So you can damage small parts of the brain and virtually not notice it. You can damage slightly larger portions and quickly recover in maybe the case of a month to 2 months full cognitive capacity. You can even damage entire brain regions or near entire brain regions and still be able to recover some cognitive abilities, especially learning. There are very few parts of the brain in which you can, if you entirely destroyed, that would not permit you from learning anything ever again. Very few areas. And there's a lot of neuroscience literature that talks about this. And if you've ever taken a neuroscience class, there's the famous one, and I hate that I'm blanking on that guy's name, but he got like a railroad track stuck in his head. It's a very, very early neuroscience psychology study, but I'm sure you'll learn about it in neuroscience. Okay, so all of this is kind of coming together to make this story that we're able to do this crazy learning ability. I would say humans have a really crazy ability to learn, right? We can learn all sorts of new things. And we do it within resource constraints. And we're always learning new things. So you might be thinking, well, Rachel, my life is like pretty normal. I do the same things. I go to school. I look at pieces of paper. I do my homework. But every time light photons hit your eye, your retinas, your brain captures that information in a slightly different way. In no two instances are you ever experiencing the exact same thing. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to experience the same thing twice, which is a nice existential philosophical question to think about if you want. But this is very different from what AI is doing and how AI is learning, and that you have static images or you have a static data set in which it may see the exact same thing twice, right? So in one sense, brains are learning constantly new situations, constantly new, always learning novelty, and we do this on the fly. It's not that you have to pause every 30 seconds to update your neurons to figure out what it is that you're seeing, right? You take in the information and you parse it as it comes. And when you learn something new after previous learning, you don't suddenly forget what you learned. So my favorite example is that you learn to ride a bike, and then you learn to drive a car, and you still know how to ride a bike, right? And this happens all the time. AIs are not good at that. And in fact, when we look at how AI learns, we see that it learns without resource constraints. And you're probably at this point thinking, well, isn't that a good thing? Why would you want to be constrained by resources? And what I'm going to argue in this presentation, backed by a lot of other work that I'm not going to show but point you to, is that resource constraints create the type of environment during evolution of humans that allowed us to have learning mechanisms or protocols that actually help us learn better than if we didn't have resource constraints. So in AIs, which don't have resource constraints or have very, very few resource constraints, typically when you want to increase a model's capacity to learn and the amount of things it can learn, you add more nodes to the network. And so basically nodes is kind of synonymous with neurons in this case, although you could argue that they're not at all like neurons. But the idea in AI is that nodes and neurons are similar. And so when you want to learn in AI, you increase the amount of nodes. And that is not what happens in the brain. So that's a big glaring difference right away. The second glaring difference between how AI learns and how brain learns is that connections are static. So you're probably familiar when you train an AI, you do a training set and then you do a test set. And normally, if you're going to put your AI into production, like in the case of Apple Siri, when you put something into production, when it's actually out there in the world using what it learned, it is no longer learning new things. Once you turn off the training episode, it's done, the connections are set. If you want to add new learning, you have to restart the training episodes. The exception to this is continual learning. So if you look in the literature at continual learning, there are some works that are trying to say, okay, how can you not have this sharp cutoff where learning ceases to exist? Because in the brain, we're constantly learning. You're almost forced. You're forced to learn, right? Whether you like it or not, you're forced to learn. You're forced to take in information and compute it. And you're going to update your brain every time you do that, whereas an AI doesn't have to update its brain every time it's computing information. So another thing is that the significant damage threshold is much lower. So what that means is that if you were to take out large chunks of the neural network and just delete them, your neural network or your AI model is not going to learn in the same capacity as it did before. And it's going to struggle without a large amount of relearning to reach the same performance level that it did before you deleted a bunch of its nodes. Or in a graph architecture, this still applies, right? And so if you haven't caught the drift, in order to learn something new, you have to train and iterate over the same things over and over again. Or in the case of graph neural networks or graph knowledge graphs, you still have to add in all of these computations before you just put something new in, right? You have to connect and integrate the information and create that information in such a way that you can adapt to novel things on the fly, which AIs are not good at. And finally, the biggest point in AI is that when you learn something new, you catastrophically degrade prior learning, which I hope you're all familiar with the problem of catastrophic forgetting. If you're not, there's a lot of literature on it, although there should probably be a lot more because we have not solved the catastrophic forgetting problem. There are a lot of papers out there that claim to have solved it. They have not solved it. They have created augmentations to the problem to extend the use of AI, which are good approaches and they're useful approaches in deep learning. But the fundamental problem of catastrophic forgetting, because of the way AI learns through backpropagation or reinforcement learning, has not been fixed. The current solution is just to add more neurons. Okay, so in case it's not clear, I just want to kind of get more into why we care so much about deep learning not being able to learn within resource constraints. It's because every time you need to learn more things, you have to add more computations. And so what we're seeing in this graph here is that the training compute time was doubling every 2 years up until about 2010. And in the last 10 years, it's been 10xing every year. 10xing every year. So we're on this exponential curve in which the next best performing AI models, and as you can see, GPT-3 is not even on here and stuff like that. The next state-of-the-art models are going to hit some vertical asymptote for the training compute time needed. And that's not fitting up with what we know about hardware. So if you're looking at this previous graph about like, okay, well, what's wrong with that? AIs are getting faster. That's a good thing. That's a good thing if hardware is keeping up. And Moore's law and Kumi's law and the statistics on hardware compute capacity are not keeping up with this. And this is very topical right now if you're familiar with the NVIDIA GPU products and the kind of disappointment surrounding their 4000 series launch that just happened. So we're already starting to see in very obvious and plain ways that the hardware is not keeping up to these demands, that we cannot stay on these trends and expect the hardware to be able to deliver the performance that we need it to deliver to continue growing our AI models. And so if you're not familiar with Moore's law, basically this guy, Gordon Moore, is a very important historical guy. He was asked at a conference, just out of the blue, some reporter ran up to him and say, "Hey, Gordon, what do you think is going to happen to chips and CPUs and computers in the next couple of years?" And he's like, "Well, basically, I've kind of been looking at the last 2 years, and it looks like we're doubling in efficiency every year, right? Or every year we double in efficiency." And that's what he said. And so someone decided that that should be a law, which isn't at all what a law is, but somehow we got the term Moore's law. And so according to Moore's law, we should double in efficiency every single year. And that's not happening. The CEO of Intel, who makes, is in charge of most of the computer chips that run across the world, has publicly stated several years ago that Moore's law is slowing down. And so now we need to turn to something like Kumi's law. So Kumi's law, again, is not a law at all, but it's rather an observation that energy cost per compute is slowing down. It's not as efficient. So this graph here is not Moore's law, it's Kumi's law. So Jonathan G. Kumi did the statistics in mapping this stuff out. And when you start to see per cost, per compute, so I think this is a base of watt per compute per, I think like flop of energy. I don't know, you can check on the link to get the exact details, but the idea here is that it's getting more expensive. It's getting more expensive, not more efficient, right? So this means we're in trouble for AIs. We're in trouble from the real perspective of we don't know if we can physically build and run the systems. And we're also in trouble with AI from a different perspective, and that we're not seeing the intelligence gains that we should expect to see. And this is a big point. So the human brain has 86 billion neurons. And if you assume that there's about 1,200, so that's 1,200 synapses on each neuron, which isn't quite accurate, it's a bit of an overestimation, you end up with around like 1.03 trillion synapses. So whether or not you think that learning has to do with the number of neurons or the number of synapses, you should be looking at these two numbers. And we already have models, AI models, that are up to more synapses than the human brain, but we don't have AGI. right? And so that should be a very glaring, obvious, like, what are we doing wrong in deep learning or on our trajectory to AGI to get to human level performance of learning, right? And in some cases, we have surpassed human level performance. That is on narrow domain learning. And we're focusing here on this talk on learning novelty, which is a feature of general learning, right? And being able to learn something new and then return to prior learning and not having forgot it. So if you click on these links here in the presentation, it'll take you to information about Wu Dao, which is the Chinese model with 1.75 trillion networks, and Google's Switch Transformer, which is 1.6 trillion learnable parameters. You can learn more about that. And to give you an idea of kind of like what this means for the economy and for us and for getting these models to do real things in our society is that, and if you click on this link, there's more information, but researchers found that just one training run of the large language model of switch transformers can generate 626,000 pounds of CO2 emissions. That's about the same as like 5 cars, like 5 car lifetimes. So the entire lifetime of 5 cars, right? And yet these models can only do narrow domain stuff. So my favorite example of trying to help us understand what I mean in the intelligence differences between these large parameter models is the comparison between Alex the Gray Parrot and GPT-3. So if we click on this link, we can see Alex the Gray Parrot, and you guys can watch it later, but he's a really cute little parrot, and he was really smart, I think back in the 90s or 80s, that's him. And he was able to do all sorts of learning tasks, and he was on the news all the time. It was a big deal. It was a very smart parrot. This lady here, his owner, taught Alex the Gray Parrot to do all of this stuff. So watch this video when you're not busy. And gray parrots have 1.6 billion neurons. And Alex the Gray Parrot could do these things, and there's more things here, but he could identify materials from touching them with his beak. He could use basic language, English language, to communicate his wants and needs. He could fly. He's a parrot, right? He can fly. He could decide what to eat. His trainer could ask him, do you want an apple or a cherry? And he would say which one he wanted and then go and eat that one. Alex could count, basic arithmetic. He could identify shapes and colors and shapes versus colors. He had color, spatial, and temporal invariance, which is something that deep learning has only recently been able to achieve. In the advent of convolutional neural networks, we finally got spatial invariance. That means when you move things around or they're not in the same exact configuration as when you found them, that your understanding of them still holds true. So spatial would be a location moving, temporal would be a time moving, and then color would be just switching colors, right? And Alex understands some causal relationships. So Alex was able to understand that if A leads to B, and that has an outcome C, that later, if a portion of A and B are there, then C will be there as well. So you can learn more about Alex and exactly how much he understood causal relationships. But he was also able to express emotions to the extent that humans can identify other animals expressing emotions, and had some basic common sense. On the set during that video, he actually said he wanted to go home, and then they took him home. And so quite a remarkable species, not as much as humans, but with only 1.6 billion neurons, that's quite a lot of different abilities of things it can learn to do. So if we compare that with GPT-3, which is a very popular natural language model that has been on the market for several months now, maybe a year, GPT-3 has 175 billion learnable parameters. That is much, 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 much more than 1.6 billion. We're working in billions. So the difference between 1 million and 100 million is much different than the difference between 1 billion and 175 billion, which is what we're looking at. So this GPT-3 model has a much more capacity in terms of sheer neurons to learn, and it can do some really cool advanced learning. It has advanced language capacity, including programming language, not just English, right? It can do language translation. Some people have shown that it can do some causal reasoning. It's not always great. It sometimes fails, but it's probably pretty comparable to Alex the Great Parrot, maybe even a little bit more robust. It has some basic common sense. You can ask it like, okay, if Sally went to the market, who went to the market, right? That's an example of causal reasoning and basic common sense, right? And it can do basic arithmetic too, probably more so than Alex the Great Parrot. But the difference here is that GPT-3, once you train it, it can only do one of these things. If you train GPT-3 to do language translation, it can't do anything else on this list. If you train GPT-3 to do basic arithmetic, it can't do other things on this list, right? So GPT-3 is trained to do something, and you get some of these loose, soft properties out of it on occasion, but you can't also train it to fly, decide what to eat, and identify shapes and colors within the same model. You'd have to retrain it. And retraining is essentially a new brain, right? Like you can't retrain Alex the Great Parrot. You'd have to get a new parrot. So there's some big differences in multiple functionality and learning versus narrow functionality and deep learning. So brain learning versus deep learning. So the question that's kind of emerging and that people are starting to really talk about, philosophers have been talking about it for quite a while, is that does more computation equal more intelligence, right? So if you're able to compute more in the brain or outside of the brain in a deep learning system, does that mean that your ability to learn is increased? So I'm not going to answer that question for you, but I think it's something that you should keep in mind as you go forward and look at your own research and what you're working on. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something called the recommendation architecture. So you've probably heard of global workspace theory by Bernie Bars or predictive processing by Anil Seth and there's some other people, or Carl Friston, and you've probably heard of integrated information theory by Giulia Tononi. These are frameworks for understanding either consciousness or cognition that kind of are dominating the field right now. And the recommendation architecture is a little less well known. It's a theory for understanding higher cognition in terms of anatomy and physiology. So what that means is that this guy, Andrew Coward, very brilliant scientist, who I've been working with over the past couple of years, he looked at a lot of the neuroscience literature as much as he could, and he tried to come up with an understanding of what was happening across all these different neuroscience experiments, across all the years of neuroscience, right? And he generated this framework to describe how this works. And what we can do is we can borrow the information from neuroscience and an understanding of neuroscience to create better AI. So if we look at the recommendation architecture, it's a very large architecture to understand. Andrew teaches a whole course on it at the Australian National University. You can look him up online and do the course for free. I highly recommend it. It'll take you a couple of months to get through. There's a lot going on here. So I'm only going to kind of recap the important points for this talk. So the recommendation architecture says that because in evolution, biological brains had a finite skull space and they only had so many neurons they could grow and they couldn't grow new neurons, they had to come up with crafty ways to learn. And one of those crafty ways to learn was something called a resource management system. And resource management system in the brain isn't one particular place or one thing. It's the protocol that helps control learning. and helps manage resources involved in learning. And Andrew Coward and others, I would argue that this learning eventually extends to consciousness, but that's a whole nother talk. So there's a couple ideas here. So synaptic pruning and growth allows for new connections, which helps us learn novelty. So when we change our connections and we grow synapses, that's how we can learn new things. The hippocampus manages change to the cortex without degrading existing learning. So when you need to make synaptic change connections or changes to synaptic connections, you need to do so in such a way that you're not screwing up stuff that you've already learned, right? And so the hippocampus works with the cortex to manage that, and that helps us retain stability while staying sustainable, right? That's kind of a fancy way of saying it, but what you're doing is that you're finding a way in which to incorporate new information without throwing the system into chaos or degrading prior learning, right? And it also does a really interesting thing that we're not going to talk about in the rest of this talk, but is really important for AGI. All of these things are important for AGI, but also cortical patterns of activation can be used as multiple condition detection. So what that means is that the brain, as part of this resource management protocol, has this ability to self-activate neurons. And when neurons are self-activated, you end up bootstrapping prior learning for a current task, which is really important, right? So when you're walking about throughout the day, you don't like constantly have to relearn gravity. You know that since you're vertical, if you tip over, that you will fall because that's how gravity works. And you have this consistent idea of gravity that's able to be carried throughout your knowledge base. And part of that is that you're constantly activating parts of your brain that understand gravity. It's a very low level example, but it can be extended far and far beyond. So what you're looking at in this diagram here is from Andrew Coward's work on the recommendation architecture. And basically you have layers of cortical neurons. And these are pyramidal neurons that detect a receptive field. And a receptive field in this case is just, you can think of it like a feature. So in deep learning, we call them features, but here we're calling them receptive fields because they're not features for a particular task. It's a field of features that identify conditions during input. So these things can self-activate to say that they are part of a current input, even if that current input isn't there. And if you think about hallucinations and psychedelics or in schizophrenia patients or other mental disorders, often what happens is that the stability of migrating these inputs through these layers, this hierarchical layer, gets disturbed. And what happens is it ends up self-activating the lower layers of the cortex. And those layers are things that define kind of the most rudimentary shapes and colors. And when those get activated, you end up experiencing some sort of situation in which, as if those things were really there, but they're not, right? So hopefully that makes sense, but there's a lot more on neuroscience literature on that. So learning efficiently in the recommendation architecture, which I will from now on refer to as the two letters RA, is that the recommendation architecture is managed by a combination of mechanisms, right? So this is how learning occurs. The hippocampus helps manage new cortical expansions to receptive fields. The hippocampus also works with the cortex to self-activate. The basal ganglia uses consequence feedback to interpret cortical condition definitions. So let's just pause there for a second, because you're probably thinking like, what is going on? So you have this cortex, and the job of the cortex is to figure out what's going on in the world, to define a condition. So let's take the example of a cat. You see a cat, that's an input condition. There are neurons in your brain which are supposed to figure out that that's a cat. The basal ganglia is interpreting what's going on in the cortex to recommend a behavior, So the basal ganglia is basically saying, hey, based on what the cortex is saying, I think you should say that that's a cat or pet the cat, because we know that when you pet cats, that's a good thing. You get rewarded for that behavior, right? And so we'll talk more about consequence feedback in just a second, but that's the basic idea. And if it's still not clear, you can think of it as the cortex is painting, and the basal ganglia is like a person in an art museum looking at that abstract painting and trying to figure out what the artist was thinking just from the abstract painting, right? And then consequence feedback would be as if the artist actually comes over to the person looking at the painting and tells them, no, I was actually thinking this. I was actually happy, or I was actually sad, right? And so in the cortex, there's a different type of learning mechanism, which has to do with Hebbian learning, which I hope you're familiar with. It just means you fire together, you wire together things that neurons that are activated together at the same time are going to end up being connected and strongly connected. And something called spike timing dependent plasticity, which is this very similar idea to Hebbian learning, uses the same principles, but it incorporates an element of time, and that exactly when things are occurring is also used to determine how things should be connected and at which strength they should be connected with. And there's also the cerebellum. I didn't want to leave that out here. It's not really super important for the rest of this talk, but the cerebellum is storing sequences of reoccurring behaviors. So motions like picking up a coffee cup, swinging a baseball bat, moving your legs, things like that, once they're learned and used repetitively, very repetitively, they get stored in the cerebellum. So if you look at musicians and sports players, athletes, you'll see a lot that their cerebellums are in very good health. And that's what they mean by turn it into muscle memory. That's your cerebellum, right? There's also more physiology stuff we could talk about there. But anyways, this is how learning happens in the recommendation architecture efficiently. And the biggest thing to take away from this slide is that the cortex cannot be informed by consequence feedback, because if the receptive fields were determined by the input, the feedback from the environment, whether it's good or bad, then the receptive fields would collapse to only identifying the most recent feedback, whatever the condition was for the most recent feedback. And that's exactly what we see in deep learning. So in deep learning and reinforcement learning, which DLRL, most of deep learning is driven by the algorithm called backpropagation, which you're probably familiar with. So in backpropagation, you generate a prediction from the neural network feed forward. And then with that prediction, you have the true label, the true target. So if it predicts that it is 72 and the correct answer, let me pick easier numbers. So if you predict that it's 70 and the correct answer is 100, the error between 70 and 100 is 30. And so that number 30 is used as part of a partial derivative equation to decide which way to update all the weights and all the layers in the neural network to start moving towards a minima on that error landscape. And so basically what's happening is that you're tuning the weights only to the current task, and you're doing that at the sake of previous things you've learned. So that's how backpropagation works. And I would argue, and others would argue, that is the fundamental reason that catastrophic forgetting exists in backpropagation-based networks. So in reinforcement learning, you have a similar situation, but you're not taking an error. You're not using error-driven learning, you're using reward-driven learning. And some people would like to point out that error-driven learning is high-dimensional, that when you're taking an error in backpropagation, that you're getting this complex landscape that's quite high-dimensional. And in reinforcement learning, when you're taking a reward signal, you're taking much more lower dimensional input. but both error and reward have a very similar effect, and that they're both types of consequence feedback. So what that means is that you're using some brain or model of a brain to make a decision. That decision becomes an action and impacts the world or the environment. That the environment then gives you feedback. Was that good or bad? So if you make a decision to put your hand on a hot stove, you will immediately get a pain response back, and that's consequence feedback, right? And consequence feedback can be conscious or non-conscious. You can have things that you're not fully aware of or able to articulate or self-report that have been imprinted on your sensory inputs that are part of consequence feedback. So the result of using consequence feedback to drive learning is that you end up needing more resources to learn, which means you're not able to learn multiple tasks. You're not able to retain learning after you learn something new. So this is kind of the problem with current AI. So I'm going to show you guys some early experiment results. You're kind of the first one to see these results, so you should be a little excited. This is pretty cool stuff. We're submitting this paper to the Frontiers Journal in about like 5 days. So I figured I would just include it for you here because it's quite topical. So we have a model of the recommendation architecture, and that model has a cortex, a thalamus, a hippocampus, a basal ganglia, and that's it. And you give inputs to the cortex, and then you get outputs after it goes through the model. The current way that the recommendation architecture model, which I'm just going to call RA model, is set up is that the thalamus, since this is a very early instantiation, most of these things have not been built out entirely. The thalamus is a very low level algorithm that actually modifies the inputs. It groups 3 inputs into one input stream using working memory. So it modifies the inputs, and then that goes into the cortex. The hippocampus manages the cortical connections and weights in the cortex. And then the cortex has some output layers to the basal ganglia, which do not change the cortex through this loop here, but they rather infer from the cortex. And then that makes outputs. So I want to highlight here the difference in consequence feedback in case it's not clear. So if you look at the right side of this diagram titled backpropagation, which is also true for reinforcement learning, you have all of your neurons in your, you have all of your neurons in your AI model, either your deep learning model or your reinforcement learning model. And those neurons help you make a behavior decision, which becomes an action and affects the environment. And then you get some feedback back, and that feedback affects every single neuron in all the layers in the model, right? And in the recommendation architecture, we're still using consequence feedback. We're not using backpropagation. It's more similar to reward. It's a little bit different, but it's still consequence feedback. But what happens is you have your layers of cortical neurons. These project into your basal ganglion neurons, and your basal ganglion neurons work with some other areas in the brain to, or in the model, to produce a behavior which affects the environment. And the consequence feedback part, this is the important part, only affects the basal ganglia interpretation. It never changes cortical neuron weights. Never changes to cortical neuron weights. It only changes the basal ganglia interpretation of the cortical neuron weights. And I'm saying cortical neuron weights, but of course these are models. So the early results that I've run, and these are literally brand new. So what you're seeing here is that the RA model learns novelty with fewer parameters. It's much, much, much more efficient at learning than backpropagation and reinforcement learning. In fact, it uses 665 times less resources, which is huge. So on the left, you have the DQN model, which is the comparison model I ran it against. And on the right, you have the recommendation architecture model. And the DQN model, if you're not familiar, is called Deep Q Network. It was proposed, I think, back in 2015, but it's still one of the state-of-the-art models that combines deep learning, backpropagation, and reinforcement learning. So it's using both error and reward as consequence feedback mechanisms to drive learning. Whereas the recommendation architecture is just it is using a combination of non-consequence feedback and consequence feedback. And so the y-axis here is the number of learnable parameters in the network times the number of learning iterations needed to get to either 70% accuracy or 90% accuracy on the task. And I just really want to point out, this is on the scale of billions, and this is on the scale of millions. I couldn't show them on the same graph without doing like a logarithmic thing, which I didn't have time to do. So I just split them up into two graphs, which is why you're seeing them like this. So we're talking about orders of magnitude less parameters and training iterations needed by splitting up the learning protocol and what drives learning in this particular way. And so I have run the 70% and the 90% for the DQN. I'm estimating the 90% for the RA model. It's currently running. Based on some earlier results, we expect it to be around this. We increased the cortical neurons from 15 to 20, and we expect to see 90% accuracy achieved, but still waiting on that result to come in. But still, for 70% accuracy, you're so many orders of magnitude more efficient than the RA model that it would be hard to think that you would have to reach this level to get the same performance out of the RA model. But anyway, so you're probably wondering about the task. So what we did is, these are very early results for this framework, right? So what we did was, if you take an array size 200 by 400 filled with all ones, and then you take a gamma frequency, which is the frequency of the thalamus, which is just a curve that's moving up and down, right? Like a cosine or a sine function, it's just a functional curve. If you use that gamma frequency as a cookie cutter to cut out each row in the array according to some predefined probability, you end up with the input. And so basically, kind of what that means in English terms is that the brain is, so if you had something like an image, you would distill that image into like a spike train. So that spike train is basically what the visual cortex is receiving. And there's a lot of work in spiking neural networks on exactly how to make the conversion between static images and spike trains. But essentially, that's what's going on here. And then there's 30 categories, and the RA model has to look at each input and decide which category it belongs to. But since you're using a probabilistic spiking method, no two inputs are ever the same. They're not the same during training, and they're not the same during testing. They're always different, but they follow some probabilistic distribution for what makes them a particular category or not. And the categories are defined at random at the beginning of each training procedure, not at each epoch, but each full training procedure. So the categories themselves are probabilistic in that sense too. Okay, so the next interesting result from this is that, and this is just for the recommendation architecture model, is that the recommendation architecture model is able to learn something new, and then still retain some learning to the first thing it learned. So I know there's a lot going on here, but let's break it down. So on the left side, what you're looking at is the percent of correct category identification, which is essentially like percentage of accuracy. And you're looking at first, second, and third. So first is the first guess the model makes. Second would be the second guess, and third, the third guess. in AI terms, this would be like if you have an output function, you would take the first max, the second max, and the third max. And these three different categories on the x-axis are different learning methods. So this is like just learn the first 15 categories, then the second 15 categories, and then test on all 30 categories. That's the usual method. The correct incorrect method, you learn on the first 15, the second set of 15 categories, and then you relearn on all 30 categories, but you don't use what is the correct label. You just tell the network that its guess is correct or incorrect. You don't tell it what is correct or what the label should be. And this is relearn is basically a control to whereas if you just relearned everything using the original learning parameters, again, how well would you do? So what we would expect to see in this diagram on the left is that blue is always bigger than purple, which is always bigger than teal. And that's what we see. That means the first guesses are correct. And we would want to see that blue is kind of high. So this is compared to the 70% accuracy that the model normally gets with this particular configuration. So it's only dropped by a couple degrees. It's at 63% accuracy. So it learned 15 categories, stopped learning, completely started learning 15 new categories, and then returned to the 15 categories and still could correctly identify those categories 63% of the time. If you introduce like a second learning phase with this correct, incorrect feedback thing, you can recover that dropped learning pretty quickly. And then of course, if you relearn, you just increase your accuracy because you're doing another full training iteration. Okay, so that's the left-hand graph. The right-hand graph is the same exact experiments, but what I'm showing you is the ratio of the first categories to second categories correct. So what you would want is that these bars are close to 1. That means it's accurately predicting the first categories, the first task, task A, which is learning all 15 first categories, and all of the 15 through 30 second categories in task B. So it means it learned task A, learned task B, goes back to task A, and both A and B are correctly identified. It doesn't know B more than it knows A, or it doesn't know A more than it knows B. The knowledge is retained equally. So a ratio of 1 would demonstrate that. So the closer these bars are to this line 1 here, the better. So you can see the usual method has a predisposition to be better at learning the second categories. And if you use correct and incorrect feedback, you redistribute that and you get this bar as close to 1 out of all of these runs as it can be, which means that just by providing this kind of quick extra retraining phase, you end up recovering the knowledge. You recover knowledge with this technique. And the relearn is kind of to show just a basic like a control to say, okay, what if you just relearned everything? The last thing you learned is still going to be slightly skewed. And so that's why you're seeing it a little bit above 1. So basically the takeaway from these early results is that 1, you can learn accuracy more efficiently with the RA model. Accuracy on the first task is retained, although slightly diminished in the RA model. And retraining with only correct and incorrect feedback signals recovers some knowledge during the split training task. Okay, so I'm just very briefly going to talk about what I'm doing with Simuli. That's all of the recommendation architecture AGI stuff. But basically, since there's such this problem with being able to scale up AI and these new models that are coming out, like this recommendation architecture and graph architectures, and there are a couple others, they're not able to be accelerated on the same hardware that deep learning is accelerated on because they don't all rely on matrix multiplication. AI is accelerated by GPUs because GPUs are really good at matrix multiplication. That's not the case for all other machine learning models or AGI models. So we're building computer hardware for AGI, and also just hyperscale computing in general. And so our flagship product, the NDPU, is using a technique called hypervectors. And I know we're kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to go through this quickly. But hypervectors are not as complicated as this diagram looks. Basically, you create a very large binary vector, like the size of 10,000, and you assign that to a value. So if it's an image, it's value like 1 through 126. If you're using binary data, you're assigning a hypervector to the value 0 or a hypervector to the value 1. And then in your original data, like the word sentence, you replace each value with your assigned hypervector. Then you end up with like a lot of hypervectors, right? However many for the length of the original data. And then you figure out which position each thing was at. So you multiply each hypervector with the position that data was at, index 1, index 2, index 3, and you end up with even more hypervectors. And so what you end up doing is something called a consensus sum operation, and you basically collapse all of those hypervectors into one hypervector. So the magic of hypervectors, and you can learn more on Pentti Kanerva's university website link, which I've linked down here, is that it has this associative learning property. So basically, you can take things like a hypervector for the name Jeff and a hypervector for the name Amy and add them up with all these different characteristics in a database and end up with only one hypervector. And then if you want to check what's in that hypervector, you can very quickly do an XOR or a cosine similarity test to establish whether or not something is in that category. And this is essentially this is the foundation of hypervectors for what is used in high dimensional computing or vector symbolic architectures. It has two names. And that sort of, associative approach is showing that AI can be performed much more efficiently, which is kind of the whole thing. So I did some early tests on like, okay, so what happens if you use hypervectors to do data stuff? So I did a data sharding test, a compression test, and a comparison test, very small test. And you get massive improvements. So this is what our chip is focused on is we have a prototype that has been able to use 178 times less memory, it's a lot faster than CPUs, it's a little bit faster than GPUs, and it uses a lot less power. And that's because it's using less memory, which should be obvious because you're compressing information into a single representation. So yeah, that's basically it. We think that the hypervector chip will be important for things like the recommendation architecture and as well as other types of computer processing. But I want to give you guys times to ask questions, clarifications, and also thank you guys for inviting me. So yeah, I'm going to shut up now and let some of you guys say some stuff.
Okay, thank you for that. That was really cool. Yeah, I had a couple, I have a bunch of questions, but a couple specific ones were, so you said that one of the important parts of the architecture that you guys built to model recommendation architecture was that the consequence feedback only affects the basal ganglia, right? How was that? It reminded me of like actor critic, which I know you used a deep QN to compare it to, so clearly they're different, but it reminded me of actor critic because the feedback only updates the critic and then the critic updates the actor indirectly that way. So how is that different, I guess?
Yeah, they're similar in the sense that you're breaking up learning into different protocols, but how you establish the values of what's in those networks, and back propagation. So in actor critic, I'm not super, it's been a while since I looked at the SAC protocol. But how you update those values are going to have to do with the learning algorithm and the way in which it feeds backwards. So you're looking at your backwards pass, basically. And what we're saying in the recommendation architecture is that there is a division between the basal ganglia and the cortex modules, so much so that you can run them on entirely separate computers at different times. That there's no feed backwards from basal ganglia to cortex. There's no direction that way at all whatsoever. It's just feed forward from cortex to basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia gets feedback from the environment, but it does not communicate that to the cortex. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So kind of an extension of that, is the cortex ever updated at all, or is it the same always?
Yeah, so it's updated according to the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is managing synaptic plasticity and weight changes in a sense. So weight changes occur naturally through Hebbian learning, which just means if things occur together that the weight increases. And the hippocampus is managing the connectivity between cortical neurons based on a simple way to explain it is based on things that occur together simultaneously in the past.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically just trying to create like a more structured way of viewing the input, basically, without any feedback from the, like what it's actually, or what the output.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly correct. So it's funneling like this raw data of information that we get through our senses and internally in our brain into a hierarchical representation that is structured. Mm-hmm. And that structure is unconstrained by environmental feedback. Mm-hmm. It's only interpreted with environmental feedback. So the basal ganglia isn't interpreting this kind of hierarchical structured information in the cortex.
Okay. And another follow-up would be, I don't really understand how the hippocampus would be controlling the cortex updates. Like it sounds like to me that the cortex is just doing like basic Hebbian learning on its own, and I don't really understand like what the hippocampus really is doing to inform that.
Yeah, so the hippocampus manages the cortical connections. So the hippocampus keeps track of all the connections in the cortex in a particular way, in a condensed way. It condenses the connections. And it has, like, you could think of it as a record. So the hippocampus keeps record of cortical neurons that fire at the same time together. And then it uses that information to suggest new connections or removal of connections, right? Which is different than just Hebbian learning, in which when something fires and synapses are there, it gets stronger. So one way you can think of it is you're actually laying the tracks. You're laying the foundation for Hebbian learning to actually work, right? And you're changing that connection based on the hippocampal protocol. And if you look in the literature and the recommendation architecture literature too, there's quite a bit of neuroscience literature on hippocampal cortical loops and how those loops are involved in dreaming and REM sleep. And that during dreaming and REM sleep, we actually do this kind of like, dreams are this fast replay of recent events. There's like probably a temporal decay curve on what recent means, right? Because you can have dreams that involve things from far long ago, right? And it uses this kind of like dreaming mechanism to figure out if new connections should be made. And it puts those new connections there. And then the next day when you wake up and you go about your day, those connections either get strengthened by Hebbian learning because you're getting inputs. And if they don't get strengthened, then they get broken down that night and those synapses get placed elsewhere, right? That's part of the resource management, right? Like you set something up, if it's not useful, you take it away and you put it somewhere else.
Interesting. So the hippocampus in your like model, your like synthetic model,
Mm-hmm.
your cortex was a network, but was it
Yeah.
like a neural network basically?
It's not like a neural, it's kind of like a neural network. It's a little different. It's set up with columns.
Mhm.
And columns aren't typically found in neural networks. So there's 15 in the 70% experiment. So there's 15 columns. Each of those columns has 3 layers. The first layer has 10 neurons. The second layer has 10 neurons. Each neuron has 1,200 synapses, which may or may not make connections with the inputs. Those connections are defined by the hippocampus. So it's different in that sense than a neural network, is that you don't have synapses and you don't have columns. But we've implemented both of those things because they're necessary for the resource management learning protocol, the non-consequence feedback learning that happens in the cortex.
And does those neurons like behave similarly to like neurons in a regular network where you're just adding a bunch of stuff together and then pushing through a nonlinear function basically?
No, they're spike based. Well, I mean, yes, kind of. It's a very vague way of describing it. So yes, kind of, but they're more similar to spiking neural networks in that you're integrating across the synapses, and then you're deciding whether or not that neuron will fire. So one cortical neuron integrates across its synapses across the input, which is 200 because it's simulating 200 milliseconds of exposure, which is the time that we can attend to something in our, it's our attention time, right? And a visual cue. And so once it decides it's going to fire or not, if it fires, it passes that signal along to whatever neurons it's connected to. And the final layer 3 in the cortex only has, I'm sorry, I think it's 20, 20, and 10. And those 10 project out. I'd have to look at the paper, I'm sorry. It's been a very long day with this paper, but there's the exact neuron count in there. But anyway, so there's some set of neurons, it projects. It's reducing the amount of neurons as it moves through the cortex, and then it projects out with only 3 basal ganglia neurons. Like, so there's 3 in the final layer, and that projects out to each basal ganglia neuron. Did that answer your question, or did I totally not answer it?
But my follow-up question was that so the cortex is made up of columns, which are made up of neurons. Is the hippocampus basically like just a separate like program, or is it also?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just a program that keeps track of a bunch of stuff and
yeah, so I mean, eventually the idea is to build it out, right? To build each of these modules out. The thalamus, hippocampus, basal ganglia are severely underdeveloped. These are like minimum requirements for what you would need to do a learning task. There's a lot more that's actually going on in each of these modules that we intend to build in. But yeah, the hippocampus is just like some alternative algorithm that's keeping track. You can think of it like an algorithm plus a record. It's like a table plus a record.
So does it have access to all the weights of the cortex?
The hippocampus?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's again, it's not really weights.
Yeah. Okay.
It's because like the neuron itself isn't a weight. There's synaptic connections, and the way those connections have weights. But whether or not the neuron fires isn't a weight, just to kind of clearly delineate from the neural network stuff. But the hippocampus does have access to what's going on in the cortex at a fine-grained level, but it has rules onto what it's allowed to do. So it's not allowed to just like affect everything. It has, that is the protocol of the hippocampus, is deciding what to select according to the information it has.
So in the brain, the hippocampus is kind of like, it's kind of small, right? Does it, it seems like you would have to project everywhere to be able to do that in the brain. Am I wrong, or how does that work?
No, that's a really good question. So basically the cortex is like if you take like a plastic bag from the grocery store, you like scoop some air up into it, and then you take the two little handles on the end and you like squish them together. And then if you like rolled it up into a spiral, that spiral roll, sorry, that spiral roll is that's the hippocampus. So that's how the hippocampus and cortex is connected. You're basically grabbing a bunch of neural tissue, squishing it together, making it smaller and spiraling it up. And the advantage that the brain has that we don't have in hardware and computers is that the brain has morphology. So location and size and shape are all like things of morphology. Location, size, and shape convey information and have rules to them, which are part of the learning algorithms and brain protocols. And we can't necessarily recreate that stuff in a computer easily. In fact, normally when you try to do that, it's way too memory intensive, and it's why we don't have like full simulations of every neuron in the brain and stuff, and lack of imaging. So you can decide for yourselves whether or not it's a gift or a curse that we either don't have to do that in computer science or that we're not able to do that in computer science. But basically, because of the morphology, there's a circuit that happens with neurochemicals between the cortex and the hippocampus. And it's kind of like a cascade of events that happens. So it's like a trickle. It's not like there's a single wire from the cortex or neuron from the cortex that's now or from the hippocampus that's now affecting the cortex, right? It's a cascade of events that trickles its way from the hippocampus to the cortex. And if you're really interested about like that circuit, Andrew Coward has like an entire week-long course or section of his course devoted to just that topic. I mean, it gets a little complex in the neuroscience, but it's extremely fascinating. The effect is that it's basically just like an on-off switch. And if you think about the cortex as buckets, and each bucket is kind of like a column, and those buckets are full of water. And when they get full, they spill to the next layer of buckets of water. And when you're close to spilling over, which means you're close to like propagating the information, right? But you're not quite there. The hippocampus, which is part of this self-activation thing we didn't really talk about, will go and it'll say, put more water in that bucket so it reaches the threshold to send that layer in that column to the next layer, right? So it's kind of this chain reaction of like, okay, increased firing here, which will have an effect of increasing firing here, which will essentially create this condition to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the best I can do without pulling out some diagrams of neurons and stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah, so another question about that is like, so you at the end you were talking about the hypervectors, and in general I've just seen a lot of different proponents of just sparse representations as a way to learn more meaningful things rather than memorize things. And it seems like that could be achieved without that could be, I mean, people do sparse representations in neural networks and dropout and things like that. But I suppose because of previously mentioned issues like catastrophic forgetting, it's still not quite the same. But it seems like, I don't know how hypervectors completely resolve issues of learning in themselves. Like, it seems like sparse representations, since they can be used in like deep learning, but they still don't resolve, general intelligence, that it's useful, but maybe not everything.
Yeah, that's not what I'm claiming. I'm not claiming that hypervectors are general intelligence, or that they're all you need for general intelligence. I think in the case of like the hippocampus, hypervectors are a really good model of that because they are sparse representations, but they're also robust to noise and they're full of information, which is why they're sometimes called holographic. So they reflect the information in the cortex without having to have the same dimensionality of the cortex. So in that sense, I think hypervectors are very useful, and that's why we've been focusing on them for AGI. I don't by all means think that sparse representations or hypervectors are all you need for AGI. And I think if you look at the HGC literature, it's quite clear that that's not true, because they're too noisy. They're too noisy, and that in order to get you have to really squeeze the hypervectors to get the information out of them. So when you're working on the level of this information, the other thing is that they're better, just like if you're just thinking about pure AI, they're computationally cheaper. It's not that they solve these problems of catastrophic forgetting, but they're computationally cheaper because they're using less memory, because they're compressions. You're basically compressing a bunch of information into a single state, and then that single state still has the same properties of the original information, so they're cheaper. So that's why we're pursuing them for AI chips. Does that make sense?
It does. So then it's sort of like it's necessary but not sufficient. But then the follow-up would be like, so the other component that you would think is necessary would be something like a better architecture, like you're suggesting with the recommendation architecture. So it's like you combine the sparse representations and the computational efficiency of that with a better architecture, and then you think, would that be enough?
No, I'm not making any claims about what would be enough. I'll make that claim if we get there. I'll backdate it. But I think the idea is that what I am claiming, what I'm very passionate about here and trying to inform the community on, like in an academic sense, through like publishing papers on this topic, is that we cannot think that backpropagation and reinforcement learning is going to get us to the type of general learning that humans are capable of, because they overwrite learning. So if those algorithms are being used to define receptive fields or features, then it's not going to work. That's what I'm claiming. I'm working on some alternative suggestions for what else to use, which is this RA model, right? And the hypervector stuff. But there could be many, many other configurations which effectively satisfy this idea of like, you should not be using that to, one good idea is to look at like extreme learning machines. So extreme learning machines are very similar to the core idea. They're quite simplistic compared to the RA model I've told you guys about. But if you're not familiar with them, basically you have just like a matrix of neuron nodes, and you initialize them randomly, and you connect them randomly, and then you send the information through, and then you only learn the last output layer using an inverse, a pseudo-inverse operation. You don't even use backpropagation. You don't need any of that. And extreme learning machines they're extreme. They're very good at learning. I highly recommend, if you haven't looked at them before, they're really fun to run because they take hardly no time, and they can be quite small and do really cool stuff. But yeah, so I definitely think there's other things out there which are kind of employing the same principle. I think what is really disappointing is we've seen a lot of big leaders in the AI field that think that just making deep learning bigger is going to make it get to this sort of general intelligence. And that's kind of the point that I'm talking to, is that that's not really appropriate. And there's counter evidence to suggest that that's even possible. But I mean, who knows? It's AGI, right? Like, until it happens, we're not really going to know. So
yeah.
Do you personally think that our road to AGI is most likely just looking closer and closer at the brain and figuring out, all the intricacies of how it learns and trying to replicate all those on a machine? Or do you think it's more of a top-down thing where we try and develop better, I don't know, overall learning theories and implementing those?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Before I got started in my PhD on this work, it's been a very long time just answering that question for myself, because I think I think honestly you need to start much if you want to work on AGI, there's some previous questions to that you might want to look at too. But that's one of the fundamental first questions is what's your approach going to be? And you need to be pretty convinced of your approach. If you want to speed up the amount of time or how much ground you can cover, you can always change approaches later, right? I personally think that it's a mixture of the two. I think looking at the brain is scary. So I wouldn't even say I'm looking at the brain. I'm looking at an understanding of the brain. So there's an understanding of the brain that has been accepted and developed, and I'm looking at that understanding to inform how to make stuff. That doesn't mean that the math that's being used in the brain needs to be the math that's used in the neural networks. That just means that the principles need to be in place and the understanding of how the mechanisms work need to be recreated. I also work pretty closely, not pretty closely, but I work with Ben Goertzel on some of the simuli stuff. And so I've had the pleasure of chatting with him and learning about what he's doing with Hyperon, his new AGI architecture. And I really like his approach. I fully support it. I think he's definitely going to be successful. The more I learn about it, the more I think that that's probably going to work. But I don't think it's the only approach, and I don't think there's only one type of AGI, right? There's probably many, many different types of AGI that can be created, and they all will have their own benefits and drawbacks. And I just happen to be really interested in this approach for my own slew of reasons. Ben's interested in his approach because of the things he wants out of it, right? So I think that's also important to remember. And that's something that I overlooked in some of the beginning of my AGI work was all of these things can coexist. They don't have to compete, and they might end up working together. I might end up being able to plug in this stuff to Ben's architecture to make it better, or I might borrow some of the principles from graph neural networks that he's working on, or pair consistent logic stuff that he's working on to fit into my architecture. And I think the ethical considerations are kind of important to helping motivate us on those choices, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have one final question, unless you have a question.
I had a really quick question. So I noticed in the presentation when you were talking about how the efficiency of hardware has been declining in comparison to current learning AI algorithms. So I've heard a bit about quantum computing. Do you know if that could be used in any way to speed up our hardware to kind of make it more in line? And
yes, yeah, that's a really great point. That's what everyone in the world is hoping for. And I'm also hoping with them that that's what's going to happen. But I use the word hope very specifically because it is still hope. If you look at the practical applications of quantum computing, they're slim. And Scott Aronson is a wonderful scientist who can tell you all about that stuff. He has really cool podcasts. He's just a great talker in general. So yeah, definitely look up Scott Aronson. I think what people are starting to get a little worried about is that we're starting to hit the brick wall on current hardware that we have now faster than we thought we were going to, perhaps. And we're still not as close to quantum as we would like to be. So there's kind of this gap. Some people are, myself included, are starting to worry that there's going to be some gap years where we're kind of just sitting in the water, the boat's not quite here yet, but we swam all this way and nothing's really able to progress that quickly, right? because we've exhausted our CMOS technologies. PIMs are too expensive. I mean, there's all these other things going on. I think, you know, I think people are starting to wake up to this issue. I mean, that's why you see a ton of money pouring into quantum, to try to accelerate the arrival of practical quantum computing sooner. So yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, because I know that currently there's a lot of computers. Quantum computing has been achieved, but the level of like complexity and the hardware required to like cool them, I think, as well. And then also we just don't have enough qubits right now. So do you like if you were to give like an estimate for how many years or like what the timeline would look like for that, would you have any idea of what that would be?
I can't estimate quantum for you, but I can estimate like Moore's law for you. So in quantum, you should look to Scott Aronson. He definitely has a list of things that need to get solved, and you know, in which order to tackle them. I mean, he's pioneering that. So he would have those answers. But so if you want to figure it out on your own, right? So a quick kind of back of the envelope calculation you can do is that we are currently at 2 nanometer transistor size. We're at 2 nanometer processes. We're just barely at 2 nanometer processes. They're not really on the market yet, but we're just now making them. So if we're at 2 nanometer size of our transistors, take the size of a single neutron or proton, right? A single atom molecule. And once you get that size, if we're supposed to be doubling every 2 years, which effectively means we're decreasing the size of our transistors every 2 years, and you take the size of the atom, we have at max 9 years left, at max. And you can work out the math on your own, depending on like the rate of Moore's law you use and which atom you use. It's going to be a little different, but 9 years is not a whole lot of time in terms of like engineering hardware stuff and reinventing kind of what's going on. And the reason that I say that that's a good back of the envelope calculation is because once you start getting down to the physical size of atoms, you're going to run into all this like weird, like physical material problems, like in physics, right? And I'm personally really doubting, and others have also really doubted, that once you get down to the size of individual atoms, that you'll be able to create these things with stability. That's not to say that there's not other computing methods, like there's DNA computing, which is really promising and very cool. There's microfluidics. There's all sorts of different processes that are even currently in the works that are trying to get ironed out, that compute on different paralogs, or there's analog computing, right? So I guess the question is like, when are we going to run out of decreasing transistor size, and what are we going to be able to readily adopt at that point? That's the question, right? I mean, that's why, like at Simuli, we're focused on looking at the logic and how to better use the logic, not make things smaller. So that's kind of our goal, is like, yes, we want things to be small and fast, but we also want to like use the small, fast things intelligently, and not just like waste them and throw them around, right?
For sure. Okay. So final question is, why work on AGI? What do you want the future to look like? This is kind of a lot. This is kind of more than one question in one question.
There's at least two right there.
And do you have any advice for us?
What was the first question? I already forgot.
Why work on AGI? I mean, it's because you want to change the future in some way.
Yeah. So. Okay. Yeah. No, I get you. So, yeah, I think that, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about this before I decided to do it. I had done a lot of work in deep learning. I had done a lot of work in biomedicine. And what I kind of realized was like you could spend a lot of your time working on single problems that will have really big impacts for the world, like solving autoimmune disease or curing cancer or you name it, right? And you could make a lot of people have really better lives doing that. And that's really important work. And I'm not saying it's not. Or some of us who maybe wouldn't have been the best at that anyways, can work on solving all problems at once. And for me, that's what AGI is. So yeah, maybe like because I didn't go into autoimmune disease, I highly doubt there's like this one-to-one relationship. But yeah, maybe because I didn't go into autoimmune disease, that like autoimmune disease lasts for more years and like a couple million people suffer longer for a couple generations until we have AGI. So there's kind of like this trade-off that I had to be okay with making morally and ethically, with saying like, I think solving all of the big problems we have, even the ones we don't really know of right now, through AGI is worth that couple extra years of putting other things on hold. And I really think at some point it's for our existence. So one thing, and I've talked about this on a podcast with Ben before, one thing that I'm personally really worried about is transhumanism, in the event that when you start getting bioimplants and you start getting like physical upgrades to your body, and we get basically like Cyberpunk 2077, you get like this huge class disparity and economic wealth gap, right? And that's just going to get larger with these tools, because the best implants or cyber medicine is most likely going to be afforded to the wealthiest people. And so the wealthiest people are going to get better in terms of intelligence and cognitive abilities and physical abilities at rates much, much quicker than people who aren't in that upper class. And I think that's detrimental for our society. I think it's a really scary thought, and I don't want to live in that world at all. I've played Cyberpunk 2077, and I don't want to live in that world. And so I think AGI is one of the few things that could help regulate transhumanism. I think it's one of the few things that could help solve some of these problems that are coming that we have no idea about, are about to hit us in the face, right? And so that's why I think AGI is super important to work on. And I think my advice to you, if you want to work on AGI, is first figure out why. Why should we make AGI? And there's different questions to start with. The question I started with is like, okay, well, I could just, if I want something that's as smart as a human, like I could just make another human, right? Like it's much, much cheaper. It's much, much cheaper, right? And they're still expensive. So it's like, what exactly am I looking for in the AGI? What do I want out of it, and why do I want it? And then start thinking about, okay, like, what would that mean for society? And then work backwards into like, okay, what would need to happen to get there? And then now you have an approach. And then, like I said earlier, like really consider your approach. Because it'll save like a lot, doing a lot of literature review will save you a lot of time just figuring out what you find interesting, right? Like I think the stuff that Ben Goertzel is doing is insanely interesting and really cool, and it's probably going to work, and I'm a huge fan of it, but it's not the thing that I like want to go to bed sleep or go to sleep thinking about, or wake up in the morning and like rush to go do. Like graph neural networks are just not it for me. I don't know, they're just not. Okay, so like that thing for me is like all of this other stuff that I talked to you about today. So I would try to find something like that. I think it's getting much easier today with AGI stuff. With people are starting to care about AGI. So you probably have more opportunities in the future to work on large collective AGI projects, because there's not that many right now, but it's probably growing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but just take it with a grain of salt. That's just my experience. So I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for talking with us. Yeah, that was really, really interesting and insightful.